First of all, let me thank you for the invitation to be here today and to participate just a bit in the life and work of your community. As a professor and the incoming academic dean at the Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, I'm involved in training some of the priests who serve here in the Diocese of Southern Virginia. So it's good to be able to be here, to be in this parish, in this diocese, and to worship alongside you this morning. Over the last couple of weeks, many of us feel like we have been through the ringer. From the Boston Marathon bombings to the fertilizer plant explosion in West Texas, to the poisoned letters sent to our elected officials, we may find ourselves ready to close the door, turn off all media, and retreat to a safe corner of our homes. And while these are real events that can provoke real and justified fear, it can become difficult to put these events in proper perspective when the airwaves are saturated with coverage that replays, reminds, and reignites our fear day after day. If we're not careful, the end result of this media saturation will not be to help us imagine and create a more just and secure society, but rather to make us a more anxious and fearful people, convinced that we are surrounded by a scary world and ready to withdraw into the safe isolation of our cocoon. Our biblical texts for today examine fear and our response to it. We begin in Eden, where Adam and Eve, having turned away from God's goodness, know fear for the first time. Specifically, after eating the forbidden fruit, the human beings see that they are naked and they hide from each other. They cover their naked bodies with leaves. Why do they do this? Is it shame? Is it embarrassment? Perhaps. But I've increasingly come to think that something more is behind this hiding. That is, having transgressed the boundaries of God, the boundaries of their own bodies no longer feel secure. They cannot trust their vulnerability with each other. They fear each other. The writer and philosopher Simone Weil made this insightful observation about Adam's and Eve's sin. She says, "It may be that vice, depravity, and crime are nearly always, or perhaps even always, in their essence, attempts to eat beauty. Attempts to eat what we should only look at. Eve began it. If she caused humanity to be lost by eating the fruit, the opposite attitude, looking at the fruit without eating it, should be what is required to save it." Weil's insight helps us understand why human beings fear each other. The beautiful is meant to be gazed upon, to be delighted in, to be participated in, but it is not meant to be plucked and consumed. A proper response to blessing allows the beauty of another person, another object, to exist outside of oneself in such a way that its integrity is maintained and its gifts can be extended. What happens next in the story continues the theme of fear and hiding. Adam and Eve hide from God. They hide from God, but I would suggest that what they are really hiding from is death. Remember, God has promised death if they eat of the fruit. And so both Adam and Eve deflect the punishment, each offering up another to be sacrificed, to bear the punishment of death. It was her fault, Adam says. It was the serpent's fault, Eve says. In some ways, this story in the garden narrates for us all of our fears. For they all return in one way or another to the fear of death, the fear of the other, and our willingness to sacrifice the other to make ourselves safe. Let me say that again. All of our fears return in one way or another to the fear of death, the fear of the other, and our willingness to sacrifice others to make ourselves safe. As the biblical story moves forward, it is disordered fear as much as anything that keeps us trapped in sin and curse. For insofar as self-preservation becomes our highest good, humans find ourselves unwilling to risk sharing God's blessing with one another. and all the more willing to destroy potential threats to our safety. The coming of Jesus, then, is among other things a divine project to save us from our fear. Jesus experiences personal rejection, political opposition, violence, torture, and death. He did not defeat fear by having an easy life. But unlike Adam and Eve, who in the face of their fear hid, blamed, and suffered exile, Jesus in the face of fear turned to God in faithfulness, extended blessing to his enemies, and accomplished a homecoming for humanity. It's important to remember that Jesus did, in fact, feel fear. He was not only fully divine, but also fully human. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, that garden that parallels and reverses the Garden of Eden, Jesus is described as greatly distressed, as afraid, even sweating blood. Yet, unlike Adam and Eve, he neither hides nor offers up someone else to save himself. Instead, he moves toward God in his fear. He seeks relief, but his prayer is not, "Save me at all costs," but rather, "Your will be done." And so, even here, or especially here, in the face of death, Jesus enacts an economy of blessing. When Peter seeks to defend Jesus with a strike against the soldiers, Jesus rebukes Peter and tells him to put away his sword. Jesus refuses to allow fear to keep him from doing what is good and right and loving and beautiful. Which is to say, he refuses the idolatry of security. He calls his followers to participate in God's pattern of gift, what we might call God's economy, in such a way that the blessings poured out upon them continue to circulate, not only across differences of race, tribe, class, and nation, but across chasms of fear and through walls of hate. Jesus taught us that trust in God's provision was the pathway to a life that generously circulates blessing. When I think about this economy that circulates blessing, I'm reminded of the closing moments of the film American Beauty, in which Lester Burnham, the main character, reflects on his life. Having just been killed in the film, sorry for that spoiler if you haven't seen it, but I figure if you haven't seen it by now, you probably won't. So Lester Burnham, the main character, having been killed at this point in the film, we get this voiceover at the end as if he's speaking to us from beyond the grave. And Lester says, "I guess I could be pretty ticked off about what happened to me, but it's hard to stay mad when there's so much beauty in the world. Sometimes I feel like I'm seeing it all at once and it's too much. My heart fills up like a balloon that's about to burst. And then I remember to relax and stop trying to hold on to it. Then it flows through me like rain, and I can't feel anything but gratitude." Generosity has to do with our capacity to get caught up in the flow of something bigger than ourselves, to imagine ourselves as a portal of divine abundance. But of course, fear can stop us cold, tempting us to close our hands and grip tightly what we have in order to stave off the unknown threats of the future. This is exactly the temptation that Jesus addresses in the verses we read this morning. Jesus says, "Therefore do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." When we trust in God's provision, we are able to release our fear of not having enough, and so release our grip on wealth. Strive for God's kingdom, Jesus tells the crowd and tells us, which includes, among other things, selling our possessions and giving alms. And if you do this, he says, these things, that is, food, clothing, security, will be given to you as well. The highest good is God's kingdom, not our security. But if we seek God's kingdom, then God will provide for our security. Some of you may have heard of the Taizé community in southern France. It's a community of Catholic and Protestant brothers. And the community was brought together by Brother Roger in the 1940s. This is a time prior to Vatican II. It's prior to the World Council of Churches. It's a time when Protestants and Catholics had very little conversation with one another. But Brother Roger was committed to creating a community that brought together these different voices, these different traditions. So he founded this community in southern France, brought together Catholic and Protestant brothers. And one of the things they did, since this was the 1940s, is they became a place of refuge for folks who were fleeing from northern France. It was especially a refuge for Jews. The community was at one point shut down by the northern Vichy government when they discovered what was going on, but as soon as the war ended, Brother Roger brought back together the community of brothers at Taizé, declaring that it would be a sign of reconciliation, a place of hospitable generosity. I visited Taizé in 1991, leading a youth group from a small church in Connecticut. And one thing I remember about our time there is that we sang a lot of songs in Polish. And if you've ever tried to read Polish, you realize that the words on the page don't really correspond to any sounds that we actually know how to make. So what we did instead, and if you know anything about Taizé music, the music tends to be chant-like and repeated. So we simply let the words wash over us a bit, and over time we were able to sing along with our brothers and sisters who were there from Poland, a very large contingent of Polish youth. We sang along, and we didn't exactly know the words we were singing, but we knew that we were together praising God. It really was an experience of breaking down boundaries and discovering commonality with the stranger. We came to understand why the brothers at Taizé referred to themselves as a parable of community. This was indeed a place where blessing flowed, unhindered by fear of the stranger. In 2005, during a service of worship, and if you've been to Taizé or if you've ever seen pictures, the worship space is quite open, at least it was when I was there, so that two of the walls were entirely open to the outside. So the whole place has a feel of flow and openness. So we were gathered in, and in 2005 then, the community had gathered, and Brother Roger was there. At this point, he was 90 years old. He was in a wheelchair. And during this service of worship, Brother Roger was tragically stabbed to death. Everyone was shocked and horrified. The community, along with friends of Taizé around the world, grieved and lamented. One would understand if an event like this led the brothers to make some changes in their open and welcoming practices. But later, when one of the brothers was asked whether anything had changed at Taizé, if any new precautions were being taken, he said, "Nothing at Taizé has changed. There is no security. No metal detectors, no surveillance, no bag checks. To make such changes would be to cease to be who they are, to cease to be a parable of community, hospitality, and reconciliation. They would rather take the risk of something like this happening again than to make themselves secure at the cost of losing their identity and witness." They embody for us the words of the psalmist. "The Lord is my light and salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid?" And so, like the brothers of Taizé, like the crowds who gathered to hear Jesus teach, we are left with two choices in the face of fear. One choice is to hide and sacrifice others for our own safety, making security our highest good. The other choice is to embrace a Christ-shaped ethic of risk, losing our lives to find them, extending blessing and generosity, because we trust that our true flourishing comes not simply from living, but from living well. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Amen.